Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Rachel Sadasi. I wouldn't quite call myself the mistress of ceremony. I'm covering, but hopefully I can do just a good job. I want to invite you, first of all, I want to acknowledge some of you, or all of you here. You are here for a very important purpose. And we have in our midst our CEO, Jose Urbina, from the Ministry of Public Utilities, Energy, Logistics, and E-Governance, whom is hosting you today. We have other representatives from the government of Belize. Bear with me while I kind of familiarize myself with who's in the room. We have representatives from the Ministry of Economic Development, Mr. Isahim Quiroz. We have from the Ministry of Finance. We have the University of Belize in our midst, Mr. Irving. We have our director, I'm just all over the place, our Director of Energy, Ryan Cobb. I want to acknowledge our colleagues from the BEL, the executive team. We have a very important guest, Mr. Mirko Schroeder. He's a sponsor, the European Union, for this event. So the government of Belize is hosting, and we have our sponsor. It's a collaboration. So they're responsible for this energy policy process today. We have a few people waiting online. I want to acknowledge Mr. Frederick Verdol from the World Bank Group. Amongst others, I believe there were 6 people logged in through the Zoom when I left the desk. We have representatives from the energy sector, CEO Menzies, from Fortis Belize. Bear with me, I'm very nervous. We have Miss Noble from Oceania. Where is she? I saw her earlier. Yeah. We have Mr. Usher, representing as VP of the BCCI. Good to have you. Now, I'm naming everyone because everyone is equally important. And all of you represent a cross-sector of voices and stakeholders that have an important say in this decision. So you are all important. It's hard when you're reading protocols and saying one is more important than the other. So I'll just say I want to acknowledge all of you this morning from the utility sector, the power and energy suppliers, the professional associations. We have Belize Compact Development Team with us. We have some of the private sectors with us. Okay, just give me a moment here. We have BWS, National Gas Company, Belize Sugar Industry Limited. I saw Mr. Neil walking just a minute ago. Where is he? Yeah, and his colleague. Okay, my apologies if I missed anyone. We want to proceed with the program. I want to invite you to stand at attention for the Belize National Anthem, followed by the EU Anthem, and then you will hear the voice of the father of our nation, the late Honorable George Cadell Price, reading the national prayer to you, and then you may be seated after that.
O land of the free by the Carib Sea, our manhood we pledge to thy liberty. No tyrants here linger, despots must flee this strand, believing of democracy. The blood of our sires which call us the Carib Sea. Nature has blessed me with wealth untold, o'er mountains and valleys where prairies roll. Our fathers, the baymen, valiant and bold, drove back the invaders as heritage old. From Mount Rio Hondo to Old Sassoon, through Coral Isle over Blue Lagoon, keep watch with the angels, the stars and moon, for freedom comes tomorrow's noon. Arise, ye sons of the Baymen's land, put on your armor, clear the land, drive back the tyrants, let despots flee. Land of the free by the Carib Sea.
Almighty and eternal God, who through Jesus Christ has revealed your glory to all nations, please protect and preserve Belize, our beloved country. God of might, wisdom, and justice, please assist our Belizean government and people with your Holy Spirit of counsel and fortitude. Let the light of your divine wisdom direct their plans and endeavors, so that with your help we may attain our just objectives. With your guidance, may all our endeavors tend to peace, social justice, liberty, national happiness, the increase of industry, sobriety, and useful knowledge. We pray, O God of mercy, for all of us, that we may be blessed in the knowledge and sanctified in the observance of your most holy law, that we may be preserved in union and in that peace which the world itself cannot give. And after enjoying the blessings of this life, please admit us, dear Lord, to that eternal reward that you have prepared for those who love you. Amen.
Please be seated. The development process of the Belize National Energy Policy started last year, sometime around this time in August. And I know that many of you have been with us throughout this journey since last year. We have many returning faces, familiar faces, and we have some new faces. We've had 2 other stakeholder consultation. This is the 3rd and hopefully the final, because the paper goes up to the cabinet at the end of this month to be finalized. And there we will have a milestone towards where we're going. I want to introduce, he's no strange face as the CEO of the ministry, to which you all are stakeholders in the energy sector, so you would have seen his face many times before. I thought it was very interesting when I was reading his bio. You know, I work directly with the energy unit, so I've hardly had one-on-one with the entire ministry, because the ministry has a very large portfolio, as you guys know. But it was quite interesting to learn that the CEO has is very dynamic in terms across spectrum of experiences in different fields over the years that he's worked. So he fits perfect for that large portfolio that is very diversified, with e-governance and logistics, which is not transport, I think post office and so on, the port of entries, and energy and public utilities. And so he's both technical and admin. He's qualified and experienced in both the technical work and the administrative work. And so I'm very happy to invite him, a very humble guy, to welcome you to this program and to share with you what we expect to proceed in today's program. Please.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mistress of Ceremony, and I hope I can meet the expectations that you just mentioned. Good morning to all of you, important stakeholders as it relates to the energy sector. Yesterday, while I was driving home, I was thinking, what can I say? This is the 3rd stakeholder as it relates to the national energy policy, one that is of utmost importance to the ministry and by extension to the government of Belize. From the government, we have had many discussions as it relates, how do we move forward within the energy sector, and of course, a big bulk of that sector is the generation of electricity. But yesterday when I arrived home, I said, you know what, let me see what ChatGPT has as it relates to what is needed for Belize to develop a strong national energy policy, and its output was very interesting. It mentions 12 points: diversification of energy sources, policy framework and incentives, regulatory reform, capacity building and education, microgrid and decentralized energy, energy storage, cross-border collaboration, energy efficiency, resilience and disaster preparedness, data and analytics. Of all of those 12, I can confidently say that most have been discussed within government and even with you all as important stakeholders of the energy sector. So without saying more, I want to welcome and express a warm welcome to you all from the Ministry of Public Utilities, Energy, Logistics, and E-Governance. And it's an honor to host this third stakeholder engagement on the national energy policy. I must also share the disclaimer that our mistress of ceremony mentioned. I'm not able to highlight each and every one of you here today, but it is important to acknowledge some of our stakeholders within the energy sector. Begin with the EU representative, Mirko, LAIT UP BELIZE, Mr. Morris, MCC representatives, Ministry of Tourism and Economic Development, Ministry of Tourism, and also I welcome the Economic Development Council, the Public Utilities Commission, staff and members of the Belize Electricity Limited, also staff and members of BWS, Fortis, welcome, Chamber of Commerce, also here present today, and also the telecom sector is being represented here by my good friend Elmer Gonzalez. I must point him out. We began many years ago working within the telecom sector as colleagues, and of course our ministry staff and the media. An energy policy implies legislative reform, and both play pivotal roles in shaping a sustainable future for Belize. With the ever-increasing demand of energy and the mounting concerns about climate change, it is imperative that we establish a comprehensive policy and reform existing legislations to address challenges effectively. The energy policy serves as a blueprint for a nation's approach to energy production, distribution, and consumption. It outlines strategies to ensure the energy sector, to ensure energy security, accessibility, affordability, and environmental responsibility. A well-defined energy policy can drive investment in renewable sources such as solar, wind, and hydroelectric power, fostering a transition away from fossil fuels and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. By incentivizing research, development of clean energy technologies, a robust energy policy can drive economic growth while mitigating the impacts of climate change. Legislative reform complements an energy policy by providing the legal framework needed to enforce and implement energy goals effectively. Existing laws often lack the agility to accommodate rapid technological advancements and changing market dynamics. By updating legislation, we can remove barriers that hinder the adoption of cleaner energy solutions and promote innovation. Moreover, legislative reforms can stimulate investment by providing certainty and stability to business operating in the energy sector, which is essential for long-term planning and risk management. The importance of energy policy and legislation and legislative reform becomes even more evident when considering the global context. Energy is a shared resource, and the global consequences of its mismanagement extends beyond national borders. Collaborative efforts are required to address issues like energy security, as disruptions in one region can create ripple effects worldwide, and we have seen that lately. By establishing international standards and agreement, we can foster cooperation, improve resource allocation, and accelerate the transition to a cleaner energy source. Furthermore, energy policy and legislative reform can enhance energy efficiency, reducing waste and promoting responsible consumption. Implementing measures like building codes, appliance standards, and energy efficiency within the transportation system can lead to substantial energy savings. This not only conserves valuable resources, but also lowers energy costs for businesses and consumers, contributing to the greater economic stability. In conclusion, the importance of an energy policy and legislative reform cannot be overstated. They are the cornerstone of a sustainable and resilient future, addressing climate change, promoting economic growth, and ensuring energy security. By formulating comprehensive energy policies and enacting forward-looking legislations, we can create an environment conducive to innovation, investment, and responsible energy consumption. The time for action is now. Now you have the opportunity to voice your opinion, your comment once more in this final, and I must stress, final stakeholder engagement before it is presented to Cabinet. We look forward to a dynamic discussion on this policy. Remember, its purpose is a two-way conversation that will enhance the document in all aspects. So once again, thank you for being here. And before closing, I welcome CEO Garcia, PUC also, President Ansirdi, to add to the list. So welcome everyone, and I look forward for the active and dynamic discussions as it relates to the national energy policy. Thank you.
Thank you, CEO Urbina. You just made mention of some notable persons, some decision makers that walked in, beside CEO Narda Garcia from the Office of the Prime Minister and Mr. Ambrose Tillett from the Public Utilities Commission. I'm also seeing President Kim Aikman from BCCI and Mr. Almendarez Leroy, I have it correct, from the Bell Trade. Welcome. So we move on. Our program, as you can see, again, not another strange face, Director of Energy for our country. He has a heavy workload, and he's a very introverted leader, in my opinion. He's the type of leader that is behind the scene, moving and shaking and making things happen. And what you see is the staff who is pushing the work. So I want to acknowledge him for the hard work that he's been doing at the Energy Unit. He's been there since 2013 with the ministry. And I can't think of anyone better to brief you on where we're at with the energy policy, where we're going, where we were, where we're at, and what's next on the energy agenda for Belize. So without further ado, I want to welcome Director Cobb.
Good morning once again, and thank you for attending this morning. Just to give a brief overview of where we're at right now. Within the energy policy, we originally had what was called an energy policy framework that was approved in the year 2012. That policy actually was intended only to take us up to 2017, which at that point it should have been revised, and in actual policy it should have been enacted. This now brings us to our current work that we're currently doing right now, where we are currently revising what that framework had said, what is our current energy situation and current needs, and what our future needs are right now. So within the last, I would say, 2 years, we have been heavily engaging stakeholders, doing different types of surveys, energy balances, data gathering, And within the last year, we've been formally doing the new energy policy. This government has acknowledged that this energy policy is crucial to the development of the country and to guiding not just the policies, but the different actions and projects that we want to take into place by updating our sustainable development goals and our commitments to climate change. So all of this has been integrated into this. And also not to mention the medium-term development goals that the country has done as well. So with this in mind, we have developed this new energy policy in collaboration with our current advisor, Mr. Jeffrey Locke. And that is the document that we have been circulating. We have gotten commitment from the government that by the end of this month, they would like to see this paper presented at Cabinet for approval. This is just the first step, because once a policy has been agreed upon, we now need to look at the different legislative reforms. The different legislative reforms will need to be looked at is seeing if if we have to review anything within the Electricity Act, the PUC Act, any other types of regulations needed in order to facilitate the different policies and programs and objectives that we have within this new policy as well. You'd have seen, if you keep up to date with the website from Public Utilities Commission, that they have also been publishing papers for public comment. These papers are also a part of this policy and the agenda of this new government. So with that said, I would like to now present with you our consultant, Mr. Locke, who will give you more in detail of what the current policy looks like. Please.
Thank you, Director Cobb, for that very precise and concise update on the energy policy. How many of you have worked with, know, or are familiar with Mr. Jeffrey Locke? Okay. I'm sure it's more than, okay, I'm seeing the hands very low. I need to see them higher so that I can distinguish. Okay, maybe half of the room. That's because he has been in the energy sector for a very, very long time, some 30 years. He's one of, I would say, one of the fathers of our energy sector here in Belize, apart from Mr. Ambrose Tillett and Mr. Mencius, who is not here, and some others that I do not know. But they are responsible for the first policy that came about in 2011 that set the foundation for where we're at now. And I had a look at that document, and many of the outcomes that we have today were a result of that, but not only that, it's a building upon. So I think it was a very, we have accomplished a lot as a nation. The energy unity is an outcome of that first policy. And so I'm saying all of this because Mr. Jeffrey Locke was a critical part of the development of the energy sector on a whole. He has been not only with the electricity sector, but also fuel. So he has a well-grounded knowledge across the board with energy, both private and public. And I will say this, working with him for the first time, I can see that he's a man that gets things done, and he's very detailed-oriented. So what he has brought to the table, in addition to the first consultant that we had working with us with the policy, that first consultant gave us a framework from the CARICOM level. But what Mr. Locke has done for us is to make the policy objectives more strategic with data-driven figures. So that makes it more strategic, and we're looking, he even went to the point of putting dollar value to the objectives, which is what we need, right? We need practical objectives. So, and he also made it adapted to our local social economic situation. So I want to invite him with a little applaud to the stage. And I think from here I could sit down, really. My job is done. Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mistress of Ceremony. Thanks to the Ministry of Public Utility, Energy, Logistics, and E-Governance for inviting me to support this process. A special thank you to GFA, who was the team I worked with to get on board. I would also like to say thanks to and acknowledge the work done prior to the work I have put in the last 3 months. So I'd like to say thanks to Mr. Ambrose Tillett, my partner in the first energy policy framework that set the foundation for what has come about to this point in the new policy. But I also want to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Dr. Gardner. We've worked together in the Caribbean, we've worked together in CARICOM, CARILEC. And so I also like to show appreciation for the work he has done in holding these stakeholder sessions and putting some information together. So I just basically have taken the baton and brought it to the finish line. So I'd like to say thanks to those who helped with that. Let me just get straight into the document. Whilst they queue it up. I would like to reiterate, whilst they queue up the document, the purpose of why we are here. The draft policy document which we have shared with you has been submitted to Cabinet already for a no objection. That's just basically getting the approval to then release that document before this third and final stakeholder session. The importance of this session is to really hear from you all. The process we intend to follow is recommendations, input that can be readily inputted into the draft document will be done, so we'll do that over the next few days. And any other recommendation, as extreme as tearing up the document might be a recommendation, that will also be recorded and submitted to Cabinet. So Cabinet has the full input of you all, either in the updates that we have done to the document, or the objections that we might get to the document. Because when Cabinet makes its decision, it should make its decision with the full input of not just us who worked on the document, but you, the stakeholders. So you have a very important role here to play today. I've been involved in these processes before, where many times we come to these sessions and people think fait accompli. We just come here to tick one document and don't approve. No, that is not the case. So your input is very, very valuable. Now, the policy. The things I'm going to cover today is a sort of summary of the document that you've gotten. And so we'll speak to the rationale of the policy. We'll do a quick overview of the sector over the last 10 years. What we did to make sure we got data to support the decisions we are making was to look at the sector since the development of the first policy framework and since the development of the energy unit, and look at the progress of the sector since 2010, because that was the baseline data we had used for the first policy framework. So we've looked at that, look at the progress of the sector, the decisions made, to be able to understand how we got here. This is not a journey starting from today. This is a journey from way back, right? Even prior to my 30 years in the industry. And so we have to take all of those things into consideration because they are valuable lessons to learn as we go forward. The worst we like to do is to repeat the mistakes or the oversights from the past. So it's best you try to learn from that as you develop the new policy. So then a big part of the discussion is going to be around the actual energy agenda, which is a summary of the policy brief, looking at every single policy position and explaining it to you. And then once we have done all of that, we'll take a break. And before we take the break, we'll allow for questions and answers on that first section. Then we come back and we look at the desired targets because these policies has clear objectives. Objectives that should be transcribed into actual numbers. Numbers in terms of the amount of energy we consume. Numbers in terms of how we use the energy. Numbers in terms of how we transform, convert the energy. Numbers that also tells us the cost of all this. When we are doing energy policies, and I've been involved in a few, both locally and in the region, many times us engineers stop at talking about terajoules and BTU and those terminologies that many times doesn't interest half of you in here, right? Might be more than half. What you're interested in is how is this going to impact development? How is this going to impact lives? Because we are doing all of this, not just for the fun of doing engineering or doing engineering planning, but we are doing it for the benefit of the nation. So we have to be able to translate it into language that we all can speak. And so yes, a lot of work went into transforming those numbers in terms of joules and BTUs and kilowatts and so on into simply dollars. We all speak that language, right? And so with doing that, then we also said if we're looking at impacting the economy, then we also have to look at the dollars involved with that. And of course, we have a commitment to the environment, so we also looked at greenhouse gases emissions and so on. So that is going to be a big part of what we discuss in terms of the targets. But as CEO has said, we could do all this plan, but it needs to be implemented. And it depends on all of us in here to implement that plan. That's the reason why you're here, because you're expected to be a part of the process, not only in developing the policy, but in executing it. You are the executors. And so as we look at the resources required to implement the plan, again, we'll have a question and answer session after that, because it's very important to get your input as to how best to implement this plan. Now, the rationale for the policy. And I have to apologize for those on my right. I am blocking most of you, right? But we will definitely provide the presentation after. And so you just have to rely on what I'm telling you and trust I'm telling you the truth. Right? Yes. So now, the rationale for the policy. And it's very simple. As Belizeans, we do spend a very high portion of the money in our pockets on energy. Inordinately high. That by itself should be a call to action. But more than that, we also have coastal communities affected by the ravages of climate change. We have that to protect. And as much as we might say, well, we're a small drop in the bucket, we have to lead by example because the impact is on us. And so what we do to protect the environment is very, very critical. Protect our resources. Now, this reality has been looked at by the government of Belize. And the medium-term strategy has been designed to address those things. So at the national level, at the governmental level, we have determined that we need to see economic transformation driven by the energy sector. We need to reduce our trade deficit, or reduce our trade deficit. It's huge, right? And energy plays a huge part in that. When you look at the amount of money we spend importing fuels, importing electricity, is very, very significant. It's a burden to our economy. And of course, we need to protect the environment. So in developing the policy, we had to make sure that the policy speaks to the national agenda, right? No ministry should be doing a policy that is divorced from the national agenda. And so it's important that we did that. And there goes the power. No, and I said I was going to continue even when that happens. Plan B. Okay, it's back. Okay. Let's go back to the previous slide, please. And while she tries to find the slide, I will continue. Now, I'm going to spend a very, very short time on the historical context. Like I said, 2010 to 2021. Actually, a separate document is being produced and should be ready by the end of September that will have much more data on how we got from 2010 to 2021. A comprehensive analysis of the sector, and that's going to be released to all of you as a background explaining the decisions we have made, but also give you context as to some of the things affecting the decisions you all will have to make. So we will look at the policy position, like the Mistress of Ceremony said, and Dr. Gardner had said, I think in a previous discussion I had with him, the new energy policy touches many of the things that were in the previous policy framework. We're just building on top of that, right? The policy framework sought to see how we could maximize our natural resources, maximize our energy resources for the benefit of the sector. And so this builds on top of that. We'll be looking at the governance structure. What was mentioned earlier is that one of the major developments coming out of the development of the first policy was the establishment of the energy unit. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, 12 years later, right, working with the energy unit, I'm happy that it was developed back then because it made it quite easier. It's still very difficult, but they have made a lot of progress in making sure they have been capturing energy data and so on. So we make decisions based on data. As we develop as a nation, the habit of making decisions based on gut feeling, based on who's delivering the message, instead of based on the realities supported by the data, we have to move to that next stage. And I'm hoping that we raise the bar when it comes to how we make decisions going forward. So the key to that governance structure was the establishment of the energy unit, which have been getting data on the sector and advising stakeholders as a consequence. And so there was at least that, I would call it, foundation has been established. Now, in looking at where we're at, we also had to look at the major players in the sector, which is all of you. And the decisions you have made, sometimes supported by policy positions of the government, or sometimes on your own. One of the examples I always like to use is the sugar industry introduction of biomass and cogeneration. That was a decision that was made before any policy said they should be doing that, right? And we all see the benefit of such a decision. And so what we are hoping going forward is there more synergy between the government and you all, so that when you make your investment, it's supported by the government. When you make certain decisions, you understand the constraints you might have to be working with based on the collaboration between all of the stakeholders in the sector. So when we look at that, we also look at the major actors in the sector, especially the investors, and look at how the policy will or may not affect them. In most instances, it does, right? And how to make sure that they can still maximize their return, right, whilst meeting the energy agenda. So it's bringing the two together. What we also we're looking more at here is the energy supply mix. What are the various energy sources we are tapping into currently, right? How much we have relied on them, right? And what are the new energy resources we should be tapping into? And so a lot of part of the work was done in looking at that. And the impact it has, obviously, on the greenhouse gases emission. Because as a part of the policy objective is also to meet those environmental commitments that we have made. Now, this is the first snapshot of the energy sector in terms of its consumption. What surprises most people when we talk about energy is this bottom bar. Because if you look at most energy policy documents, the moment you start talking about energy, you replace the word energy with electricity. I've been in many energy discussions, locally, regionally. And you talk about energy, and before you know it, you're talking about electricity alone. When the biggest consumer is the transport sector. Let's be honest with ourselves. Every payday, when we think about the fuel bill, right, it hurts us many times more than our light bill, right? Per household, especially when you have more than one vehicles in the household. All right? And so, yes, as an ex-BEL man, sometimes we say, we're not as important. No, we have to recognize that the biggest part of our consumption is in the transport sector. And what are we going to do about it? Right? Then we look at the development in terms of bagasse as our next major energy source. We look at butane, and then the imported electricity. And our next area that most of us in the city don't know about is we are still consuming a lot of firewood for energy use, right? And so that also has to be looked at from a standpoint of environmental, but safety reasons as well. Because remember, it is access to reliable and cost-effective energy sources. So we also have to look at that. And so this is the first attempt to dollarize our consumption. And this is at the primary energy source. So if you notice, bagasse has barely any value because it's a cheap energy source, right? But you look at here, You look here to see what takes most of our dollars? Fossil fuels. So many times when I look at energy plans, energy policies that don't address fossil fuels, it's like you're building a plan for 1/3 of your business. Who does that? Who does that? Right? So if you want to look at energy comprehensively, you have to pay attention to the transport sector. And that's the reason why I chose this type of graph instead of the typical pie chart and so on, because I think this properly explains the issue we have at hand. It doesn't mean the others aren't important, but it means we have to start paying attention to fossil fuel. And then this is a more detailed breakdown of the dollar spent by energy source or category of energy source, by the key sectors. So you have transport and agriculture because we are looking at the agricultural equipments and so on that also consume fossil fuels. You have residential and lighting and road lighting really, commercial buildings and so on, and agro-processing. When you look here, transport was responsible in 2010 for 50% of our expenditure. The bad news is, it has gotten worse. It's now 55% of our expenditure. So, despite the fact that we established a policy, despite the fact that we had players involved in terms of the energy unit, despite the effort we have made, we are still going in the wrong direction. And when you think about this, it is not only the dollars spent, most of that is US dollars. And I could tell you the days when, because yes, I spent about 15 years of the 30 years in the petroleum sector, and I could tell you the days when two things used to happen. One, you have to be knocking on central bank door to get US currency to pay the energy bill. Otherwise, the next ship won't come. And two, the Ministry of Finance, well, really Customs Department, calls you about a week early every month and say, can you pay your duties early? Because we have to cover payroll. These are real stories. I can tell you, I've lived them. The bill was so huge that the duties associated with them was so important. If the government does not get those duties in, they can't pay your salary. How many of you all are paid by government somehow or the other in here? You can raise your hands. I'm asking that question because I'm saying we are still not out of the woods. Those things can still happen. I'm out of the petroleum sector, so I don't know if they are still happening. But your salary is at stake. So if they want any more call to action, right, that's one for you. So it's very important that we look at a policy holistically that will be addressing all of these issues. Now, this wasn't just because we wanted to be an artist putting fancy colors together. But without the numbers, you could make a nice little backdrop somewhere, right? No, this is an attempt to show how energy is consumed, not only how it's consumed, how it's supplied, but also something that is always overlooked, how it's converted. I'll give you an next example. One of my first jobs coming back to Belize after I did my engineering degree was as the operations engineer for BEB. That's how old I am, right? And the name Belize Electricity Board. So you know what's the focus, right? Electricity. And I said, hold on. What we buy is fuel that has to be converted to electricity. And so we spent a lot of time looking at line losses. That time it was only distribution line losses because there was no transmission grid. What's the typical distribution loss, Mr. Moreno? About 6%. And the generators, because it was generators we were using back then, designed to be running to giving you 14 kilowatt hours per gallon, we're giving you 11, 12 kilowatt hours per gallon. Do the maths. Where's the bigger loss? Conversion. So when we talk about energy efficiency, we are not only going to talk about efficiency at usage. The bigger efficiency which we're talking about is in conversion. Conversion of water to electricity, conversion of bagasse to electricity. All of the energy source that we convert to electricity, we need to ensure that we are doing it efficiently. Because the first benefit you're going to get from that, the more efficient you can convert that resource, it means the bigger your output. The bigger your output for the same investment cost should translate to what? Lower costs. All right? So, yes, we always tend to focus here and here. I'd like to ask the question, how many people are involved with the transformation or the transportation of energy? So in the case of fuels, you have distributors in here to transport that fuel to the end user, right? In terms of hydro, you convert it to electricity. In terms of bagasse, how many of you are in the conversion business? Can I see a show of hands? Thank you. So the message is you have a very important role to play in this energy balance. A very important role to play in energy efficiency. We always talk about energy efficiency as, buildings, making sure the buildings are properly insulated, making sure the vehicles are efficient vehicles, all necessary. But don't forget energy conversion, energy transportation. All right? And so this shows you that private transport accounts for 22% of the energy we consume. Disclaimer, estimated. Why? Because we still don't have the proper data management system that could make sure that the energy, the fuel sold through retail network versus the fuel sold through commercial network, which is the bulk delivery, and those type of data. And the informal market, yes, Ryan, right, are captured to give us a full picture of the breakdown of usage. Right? In the good old days, we used to actually share that data. When I was the country manager for Shell, we used to have an agreement with the country manager for Exxon, the country manager for Texaco, where monthly we share that breakdown. So we know how the fuel is being used. In doing the data collection for this exercise, sadly, it doesn't happen anymore. So we had to go on estimates to be able to do that. But I would like to see the day when we have those precise data so that we could have even more confidence in our estimations or calculations, because data should be driving our decision. So private transport, 22%, industry, 20%, public transport, 16%. Industry and commercial is hopefully where we make our money, either in producing goods or providing services. Only accounting for 34% of the energy we are using. So we have some work to do. But without the data, how do you know where to put your attention? So, the policy agenda. What's the vision statement? I've said it in many different ways just now, but this is the official statement. Improve the country's ability to effectively manage the sector, and I will get to that in a few, so that we could stimulate social and economic development through here, improving, working with the cross-cutting sectors, and also at the end of the day, making sure we do our part in contributing to the updated national determined contribution. So we're not leaving out the environment. But we are saying we are doing this for economic benefit, we are doing this for social benefit, and also for environmental benefit. So that then drives the policies which we have shared with you in the document we've sent to you. So I'll just quickly, well, as quick as I can, go through them. I mentioned in the policy objective, effectively manage the sector. So even though we established the energy unit, this is what I said to Ryan and to CEO, it has no teeth. Meaning, it has no power by law to effect and drive the changes that are required for the industry. So Ryan has to rely on his good looks, ability to appeal to you all to get things done. So what is necessary is for that pool of resources who are being asked to, in a central way, provide oversight for the industry and guide its progress in terms of implementing the plan. That entity needs to be established in law. Right? To be able to get some of the things that needs to be done. So, looking at the last 12 years, the work that Mr. Tillett, Mr. Mencias, and myself did is far from complete. And one of the key factors behind it is enforcement, right? That is required in law to get some of these things done. Once you've had the central body, it doesn't stop there. You have the regulators. You have other players that we are seeing necessary to support the development in this sector that needs to be put in place. And so it is strengthening those functions. So we are saying the foundation to this policy relies on people. People empowered to do the things that are necessary to advance the energy agenda. And so, first part of the policy addresses that. Then, the government recognizes the need for information. You all many times are making decisions blindly or with a blinder on, right? How much more beneficial will it be for you if you had more information to work with? Because the information is not just for the technocrats in the government to have. It is asking to build an energy information platform that stakeholders can have access to. But do it in a seamless way that you don't spend all of your energy collecting the data and not enough energy left to analyze the data. Because sometimes that's what happens to us. I always remind Glenn that how much I've been underpaid to do this, because a lot more energy was required to gather the data. So by the time it's time to analyze the data, some days I'm on fumes. I'm out of energy. Whereas if you could establish, and the technology is here, if you could establish the platform for information sharing, right? in a way that it be able to generate the information and make it accessible to its stakeholders. That's the way to go. If we can do that, your lives should be easier. And I don't want to sound like a politician, right? I'm almost sounding like that. But no, with information, you will be able to make better decisions. That's the bottom line. And so it's, as a part of the institutional strengthening, is to make sure that we have increased access to energy information. Now, let's get to the real objectives. So we're doing all of those foundational work, but it's about what? Stimulating social and economic and social development. Those are just foundational work we're looking at first. We're getting into the real meat of it. And the first one is to reduce our energy bill. And we're using technical terminologies when we talk about reducing energy intensity. What it's really saying is that let's try to find a more energy efficient way to travel from point A to point B. Let's find a more energy efficient way to produce this commodity. Let's find a more energy efficient way of going about our lives. We do that, we reduce our energy bill, right? We reduce our costs, more dollars in our pocket for more development or just to enjoy life. But the bottom line is we have to reduce our energy bill. We have to reduce our energy intensity. And there are lists, I think it was about eight or so actions that we have identified, including insulating buildings, the CARICOM building codes, and all of those things, compliance with standards, labeling. So there's a host of things that we are looking at as to how do we go about reducing our energy intensity, hence reducing our energy bill. And then this is the big one. This is the big one. Although I keep talking about as if all of them are the big one, eh? But transitioning to indigenous energy resources, domestic production of energy, reduce the demands we have for foreign currency, right? And we are seeing that the technology is available for many of these various energy sources that we could end up producing them in a cost-effective manner. It requires a lot of research, right? This is not something you just say, oh, it works in Mexico, let's do it in Belize. It works in Jamaica, let's do it in Belize. It requires the necessary research. It requires a lot of background work. And so a part of supporting this process, the government is committed to making sure that those research are done. And truthfully, a lot of studies have already been done. But sometimes it's to bring them together, make sense out of all of them, and so on, to make sure that you, the stakeholders, are aware where the opportunities are in the energy sector. Because this is where the big money comes in. This is where hopefully we could see a public-private partnerships in investing in those indigenous energy resources. This is the big bang, but this takes a lot of work. But we won't transition from previous graphs I showed with fossil fuel dominating the game until we address this. Then the next one, we speak about social development. A significant portion of our country still does not have access to safe, reliable, dependable, cost-effective energy sources. You notice I did not say electricity, because it's more than electricity. I think I pointed out to you the consumption of firewood not quite safe, not quite healthy, actually unhealthy, right? So we have to look at how do we, as a nation, ensure that everyone has access, universal access. Coming to the issue of electricity, and my ex-colleagues from BEL could tell you this. You have homes that kids have to go under the nearest lamppost to do their work, homework, because they don't have access. Those are real stories, right? Imagine the impact on that family. It impacts the child's ability to learn. It impacts the child's ability to get basic qualifications, to get a good job. And it mushrooms. So access to energy is very critical, not just for quality of life alone, but full social development. I was asked by someone some months ago, they were saying, when you look at these policies, do you contemplate the impact on women? And I said, who runs our households? Who runs our households? The households that don't have electricity, who do you think carries that burden? The mother. You want to have impact on women? Address access to electricity. Make sure that mother don't have to consider the disadvantage her family or her children will have because they don't have access to electricity. This is the cross-cutting effect of this sector. And so we have to be aware of these things. And then, next collaborative effort on the effort to monitor and minimize greenhouse gas emissions. We made the case very early, talking about the rationale for the policy. We have many coastal line communities. We have to do our part in reducing greenhouse gases. But that requires a collaborative effort. And we are hoping that the type of collaboration we can build in the energy sector amongst ministries, amongst agencies, within the various government agencies, becomes a best practice as how government ministries work together, how agencies work together. Because I could tell you, there's room for improvement. And so if we can do that within the energy sector, we'll make a difference not only to energy consumers, but we will be able to establish how to make this work for other sectors within the government and within our country. And so those are the 7 policy objectives developed in this energy policy document. Now, you've seen the document, like I said, right? We're going to open the floor at this point for comments of what you have read or what you have heard, right? Then we'll take a break, and then we go back into the things about the targets and implementation. So we're now going to open the floor. Where's our mistress of ceremony? She's coming. To field any question, not only for myself, but for the team here at the head table on the draft policy that we have developed today. Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Any questions at all based on the presentation? And I just want to quickly say thank you very much for your kind diligence with us. I am aware that we sent the policy document very late, and you have a short window of time or had a short window of time, if you had the time to review the document. But based on what was presented so far, if you have any questions, just to reiterate what I believe it was Mr. Locke mentioned, that the purpose of us being here is for you to provide feedback on what you think is missing or what you think would not work practically. Anything at all that the government would be able to consider and the cabinet would be able to consider from your point of view before finalizing or passing the energy policy. Yes, Mr. Kiros.
Good morning, Ishmael Kiros, Office of the Prime Minister. Especially in the context of e-governance, and this speaks to the point about data-driven decision-making, which I'm very happy to see that that's a focus of it. Just to point out that the Public Sector Data Sharing Act already exists. It calls for the establishment of an Office of Data Analysis. It's within the same ministry. And so a question or a suggestion is, can something be built into the policy that supports the implementation of that act and what it recommends? It speaks specifically to e-governance, but it goes to show how important data sharing is across all sectors.
Thank you, Mr. Kiros. We're happy to report that we have referenced the act in the policy. In other words, we are not seeking some other method of data sharing. It is in compliance with the Data Sharing Act.
Do we have any other? Okay, Mr. William.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Excellent presentation and synopsis. I am just a little bit more curious about your thoughts with regards to public and private sector collaborations. What do you think are the deterrents? We know obviously the benefits, but that's definitely something that we've not seen take root in Belize. What would you say needs to happen to make that a reality?
Thanks for the question. Probably I should refer this to Dr. Canton. There is a public and private partnership between a national gas company. So he can speak to that reality. I could also probably speak to Ms. Kay Menzies on the board of BEL, which is a public-private partnership. So one of the things we have pointed out is currently the government, when you include Social Security Board, has about $400 million already invested in public and private partnership in the energy sector. So the good news there is it's happening. More to be done, and we do believe that with a policy and the infrastructure to support it, it will make it more effective and efficient as to how. Because now the directions are very clear what you also be working towards. All right?
Just to add on that topic, it is important from the government perspective also. The government has also developed a PPP policy to ensure that there is the framework to follow. As a government, we realize that it's important that we engage the private sector and partner with them in these types of projects. It is capital intensive, so we definitely see the benefit in terms of partnering and collaborating with the private sector from that aspect. CEO Garcia.
Just to add a little bit more on what you said, CEO Urbina, the Office of the Prime Minister has already established the unit. We have personnel coming on board for September, and we have a committee already, a committee that will look from the private and public sector. But of course, energy is a big area and a big sector that we're looking at. So we are move away more from the policy into the implementation now of the unit and of the project. So just wanted you to know that.
We have a comment or question from Mr. Usher here in the lovely Lux.
Good morning, William Usher, Chamber of Commerce, GSR Energy as well. Mr. Locke, I certainly want to congratulate you on this policy, and particularly in relation to Objective 5, which is the indigenous mix within the energy policy. I think and I hope now that it is clear to government that energy is not just only electricity. And that is very important. And the fact that you brought up the information of which we as project developers found out some 10 years ago that is a key component for which and the reason why we propose projects in terms of ethanol and biofuel issues. But it's important as well, not only for government to look at it as just for domestic consumption, as it seems to state within the document, but more so for export, because the demand within the CARICOM region, the demand in North America is very high due to the issue of the flex vehicles, etc., that is in those areas. And you spoke about that in terms of transportation. I just wanted to make that comment and want for everybody to understand that that is an important sector that we need to look at.
Thanks very much. The policy speaks to maximizing the resources, right? Which means that if the output is more than is required in Belize, the opportunity is there to trade. I could tell you in the electricity sector, the agreement is already in place for any excess energy produced, electrical energy produced. There is an agreement with Mexico for trading in energy. I remember the last shareholder meeting that I presented at BL, that was one of the major messages, that it is about the future in energy is in energy trading. It's in energy trading. So once you can maximize your resources, right, to take advantage of the regional market or wherever, it should be done. And that's the reason why we specifically said maximize the resources, not just for local consumption. Obviously, any responsible government would want to make sure that its citizens benefit from that first and foremost.
Good morning, Mirko Schröder from the European Union. Thanks, Mr. Locke, for the excellent presentation. Thanks, CEO Urbina, and to Mr. Kopp as well for the commitment of the ministry. The European Union is very glad to collaborate and sponsor the update of the policy. And I'm glad to hear the positive feedback of the audience. I would like to be a bit critical about the objectives, because I think you mentioned it. You mentioned that the objective 5 and 6 are the big ones. So my question is, why do you start with the smaller ones? I would put them first, to be honest, because it gives clearly the direction for the country, for the involved stakeholders. And the first policy objectives, I see them more as the how to reach them. And I would put the what we want to achieve first. So perhaps, well, you can rethink or justify the order you put there, and also the vision. I like when the visions are very clear and comprehensible to everyone, and sometimes the shorter, the clearer, the better. But I know always the challenge is you want to put more and more, and everyone gives his 2 cents to the vision, so it gets wider and wider. And the last comment is, I don't see really the transport sector reflected in the objectives. You mentioned that's the most important, but a specific objective related to the transport sector, I can't see it. Thanks.
Thanks very much for your feedback. And like I said, one of the key things we're doing here today is to document all the feedback we get. Like I said, the feedback could be as extreme as, we don't like that document, tear it up. Right? It still should be documented. And then cabinet then makes a decision on what to do about it. To take the last part first, the same number 5 you mentioned, which talks about the indigenous supplies, covers all energy sources, including fuel. So if you look at the recommended actions that supports that, it will then speak to the detail. But at the policy position, we looked at all energy sources that covers both electrical needs, electricity needs, heating needs, and transportation needs. So it's covered, just not highlighted as a specific item, because we are looking at the resource that we are maximizing to produce those secondary energy sources. All right. But yes, in terms of the order, probably it is biased by the last 12 years' experience, where most of those policy objectives were stated, except the objective to make sure that the people are there to do it. Otherwise, it becomes a nice document. And so strategically, it's like saying, you have to do this first, and I'll address it in the second part. You have to get this right first to be able to get the other things done. Otherwise, we'll be right back here 12 years later without the other things done. So that was the basis for it. Might not be the best approach, but it was seen as foundational. In other words, until you get the people in place to get it done, you might just not get anything done.
Okay, we have a comment from Mr. Herschel Armstrong, the BL gentleman here.
Just walk right past. Good morning. Excellent presentation, Mr. Lott. I think I just want to maybe piggyback on what Mirko was saying just now regarding policy objective number 5. I think we definitely see that as perhaps the most critical. And I think it's also missing a key phrase, energy security. I think that's part of what we would have expected to see and come out of the policy in particular for the country. And so before we reach energy trade, before we reach the idea of being able to share energy, we need to make sure that we are secure nationally. And we've experienced it recently where that's maybe perhaps the most urgent and critical issue in our minds here, at least in the electricity sector, of course. But I think that can help to maybe cement and give some more teeth to what we're trying to achieve with this policy. And I think the vision statement perhaps should also state that, to be honest. But just personally.
Yeah. I remember there's a lot of debate around that specific statement in terms of making energy security a critical factor in it. The argument that have been presented against it is that energy security by itself is limited. In other words, if you're not trying to maximize your resources, right, you might end up just producing enough for what you need. And what happens to the objective of economic development? If you look at energy security by itself, at what cost? In other words, when you make energy security the focus, you might be prepared to pay 50%, not 50%, that's an exaggeration, 20% more just because you want it for security. But if you produce it to trade it, you better be competitive. And that's how you get the best price for your market, when it's competitive regionally. I've seen it happen. I've seen many developers come and say, oh, you're spending, I was working with one less than a year ago. Oh, you're spending, I just use a number for the sake of use a number. You're spending 20 US cents on electricity. Oh, we could come and make it cheaper at 18 cents. But the technology you're bringing, it should be 6 cents. And you're happy because you're achieving security and you're getting a little 10% reduction. All right? But are you maximizing your resources? Once you maximize it, you're gonna get the benefit of it. But energy security by itself is limiting. All right.
We have a question from one of our online viewers via Zoom, Mr. Frederick Verdol from the World Bank Group, and he asks, some objectives are precise action items, others are broad strategic directions. Does the ministry envision to have other policy implemented as an immediate follow-up to this Energy Policy Act? For instance, an amendment to the Electricity Act or an amendment on the transport policies? I'm not sure if this question is for the ministry or...
Yeah, I'll try to answer that question. Of course, there has to be encompassing changes as it relates to legislative or the legislation framework that we currently have. It will be reviewed and recommendations will be made. Of course, it's always in collaboration and partnership with stakeholders that the recommendation will then be made in terms of those changes. So to answer the question, yes, we are looking at the legislative framework and how to enhance that to ensure we are able to meet the policy or complement the policy.
And just to add on to that, apart from finalizing what this policy will be, as our colleagues online have stated, this is much more of a broad policy and strategy. We will also be developing other policies, strategies, and action plans that will complement it. For example, we're currently working on another policy that tackles specifically rural energy access. And that's much more detailed. It's much more in the form of an action plan or a roadmap, which we will be developing. We'll also have to, of course, develop these for things in areas of energy efficiency and also in collaboration with the ministry with responsibility for transport, for the transport sector as well. By not just improving the efficiencies of transport, but also the shifts in technologies, such as the electrification of transportation with electric mobility, such as electric buses and electric motor vehicles and personalized transportations. So there are other policies, strategies, and roadmaps that we will be developing after this policy.
Thank you.
Hi, good morning, Abel Castaneda.
Can you identify yourself also?
Yeah, Abel Castaneda, Ministry of Tourism. Just two questions, maybe a follow-up to what Ryan just mentioned. I noticed in the beginning of the presentation, you had a indication there where it says changing behavior, right? And I noticed that the policy is very much sort of weighed more on the supply side of things. Is there maybe those action plans that you were mentioning, anything that has to do more with changing consumer behavior. I come from the tourism sector, and that's something that, well, I'm sure Ryan can attest to, that the behavior is something that we always try to manage. However, trends change, and we just want to make sure that that's something that's being kept from a priority, but also for Belizeans, taking off, being energy conscious, taking off the light when you leave the room, that type of thing. That's my first one. The second one has to do more with climate resilience. I do note, yes, we have the whole objective on the NDC, but climate resilience is something that, in my mind, I'm not seeing it as enveloped within the policy. Maybe I'm missing something, but I'll give you the example. You just spoke about electric vehicles. Right before the session started, I kind of mentioned a little joke of truth in that there was someone that got an EV vehicle during the same time that Hurricane Lisa passed through, and so there was no electricity to actually charge that vehicle. So how do we, on a larger scale, not just with transportation, but on a larger scale with our our energy supply, are able to build climate resilience within it and within the policy? Thanks.
Sure. On the first one, on changing behavior, yes. So our follow-up road plans will definitely have that in mind. But from my experience, that's one of the most difficult tasks to accomplish. The one advantage that we do have within the energy sector is the use of technology. I find it far easier to implement technology than actual changing human behavior. For example, bringing it back to the tourism sector, is bringing the education, bringing the tools, and bringing the policies and incentives necessary for establishments to put in different mechanisms that, for example, when you go into a hotel room, you have to have a card that you have to put in that basically turns on the electrical devices within the room, which means that whenever you leave the room and you leave with the card, all of those automatically turn off. Because I imagine that one of the worst practices that you see within the sector is that tourists go into a room, turn on the AC, go the entire day out, and leave the AC on the entire day. By implementing technology, we can avoid this without necessarily changing human behavior, but definitely there are other aspects that we need to implement in that aspect as well. On the other aspect of including energy resilience. Energy resilience is definitely one of our focal points. I would say that when we talk about energy within the inner circles of the energy stakeholders, energy resilience is somewhat of a given when we talk about it. We always plan with resilience in mind. For example, our partners with Belize Electricity Limited, they're thinking about resilience on how to keep our transmission systems robust, how to make rings so as to make our distribution more robust, so as to bring up services much more easier. We are talking with our partners within the Public Utilities Commission so as to allow other forms of generation and distributed generation, which also increases individual customer resilience to any types of climate change and other external shocks as well. So these are considerations within these policies and the roadmaps that we will be developing. But as I said, maybe we need to look at the language that we're currently using within this policy and ensure that it is ingrained in it, specifically stating energy resilience.
To add a little bit more, as it relates to the transportation sector, the ministry is currently, of course, in partnership with the EU and UNDP, also looking at the pilot project for the e-mobility project or program, which really looks at e-mobility or electric vehicles, and also it has a component that deals with charging infrastructure and also policy and regulatory framework that we're working on. But there's also the misconception in terms of the example that was used that during the hurricane or after the hurricane, there was no way to charge the vehicle. If your vehicle combustion gasoline vehicle would be in empty, I'm pretty sure you would not be able to reach access a gas station to fuel up your vehicle. So we also need to look at the language we use when we speak to the general public in terms of the pros and the cons of electric vehicles, because some of the examples we use are really, yes, they are practical examples, but they also indicate that if you're running your vehicle on E, then it also poses a challenge, both in terms of the distance you need to travel. It's comparative, the fuel and the charge of the vehicle. So it's comparative. The change management aspect of it, yes, it is challenging. And as a ministry, we have been working along, and we use the example EU at the park, where we launched the distribution of LED bulbs. So we're trying to sensitize the general public in terms of being more energy efficient, both from the residential perspective, and of course, I think that through regulatory improvements, we can then look at how corporate entities can also implement some of the technologies that can be used nowadays to make or maximize energy efficiency in those institutions.
Do we have any more comments? I know we're fast approaching. Time is going, and we have the food set out already, but I don't want to stop you while your thoughts are brewing.
Good morning. I'm Rose Tillett, Public Utilities Commission. CEO Ryan, Jeffrey, excellent work, excellent presentation. I think you're right. It is good to see here in Belize that we build on work we have done before. We sometimes have this cultural thing where we feel that we need to start over. And I think this is an excellent example of us using what we have learned. We learn lessons from what has not worked, and we try to now move forward more efficiently and more economically. I think it may be useful to look at the objectives, the way they are done. I understand the rationale. In fact, before our colleagues from the EU made their comment about the objectives, I actually saw it in the same sense you saw it, which is one of the weaknesses, the great weaknesses we have had over the last 12 years has been the failure to put in the institutional capacity to do what we say we want to do. And I can understand why you made the first two objectives like you're saying, I have to get this done. Because if I don't put this in place, then I'm going to end up with the same place I am now. But I also see the value in the way how the pillars were done the last time, where, for example, on the NU side, it was segmented into buildings, transport, and in the case of resources, it was broken down into heating, electricity, fuels. I think people may find that, so I would say maybe that might be a way to do it, Jeff, but just my advice. But excellent work, though. I don't want to take that away from you guys. Excellent work.
I would like to add to what Mr. Tillett said from my non-technical perspective. What I'm observing a lot, having been a part of this process from the beginning as a moderator of the conversations that are taking place amongst the stakeholders, between the stakeholders and the government of Belize, is where we kind of get confused between the lines of the policy, which is a general guideline as to where we want to go, and the sort of work plan or the strategy which comes after the main policy, and which is more of the work of you, the stakeholders, because you are the ones who can say how the job will get done. But the policy is saying what needs to get done. And so it also ties into the question that Mr. Verdol had about general direction versus more strategic outcomes. And so this afternoon, we will have plenty more time to have more discussions, because we will be more looking at the practical aspect of what it would look like for these objectives to become reality. For example, what the governance structure would more or less look like, and other aspects of the policy. But for now, let's have a break. And the refreshments are already put out for you, and we'll do 10, maybe 15 minutes at most, and we'll come back and have that discussion on implementation. Thank you.
So it's part 2 now, and we are hoping that part 2, in terms of the presentation, will be quite a bit shorter, because we're just looking at the targets, in other words, what is it that we are trying to achieve based on some key performance indicators. And then we look at a very high level implementation in terms of some basic timelines and the type of resources we will need to make this plan, or policy, manifest itself into a plan for full implementation. So the key performance indicators coming out of the policy, Miracle, is driven around the objectives that we spoke about, right? We talk about objective 4, 5, 6, and 7, where we are looking at energy intensity with the intent to reduce energy costs. And so currently, based on the estimates, the energy consumed as a percentage of the gross domestic product is, in terms of cost, I'm going straight to the bottom line first, cost. The money we spent on energy in 2021 is equivalent to 21% of our GDP. That's unsustainable. I wouldn't even say it's significant, it's unsustainable. Right? The money we spent on energy, which is the market value at the end user, right, is equivalent to 21% of our GDP. Our energy intensity is 0.188. In the document, we gave you some energy intensities of other countries of the G20. We give you energy intensity of countries in the region for you to be able to reference the simple fact that basically for the amount of production, for our level of production as a country, we are using too much energy. We need to be more energy efficient. Right? And so in the document, you will see reference to different range of countries, right? And it also, the reference document could give you the links to about 170 countries, right? Where you could see the energy intensity for those countries. And you'll see we are simply too expensive. Then objective 5, which is the indigenous energy mix. In 2021, we estimated that the energy from the domestic produced energy makes up 39% of the overall primary energy supply, right? and the objective is to move this in an upward trend. The renewable energy penetration, because some of the domestic energy produced is not renewable energy. It's crude, right? And so the renewable energy penetration is slightly less, it's 36%, right? And the objective is by 2040 to get it up to 70%. So basically, that's a significant ask. That's a significant shift. That will take, like I used to always say in BEL, all hands on deck. This will require a concerted effort to make this happen, right? In terms of access, and we looked at the definition of access, and we look at access to what we consider as basic, in the case of electricity supply. And based on information gathered by GFA, LAIT UP BELIZE from their survey, it is lower than the data that BEL uses. Again, a need to harmonize data and so on, right? The number it has is at 92%. Like I said, that's an area, again, where there will be need to harmonize the data. I think when I left BEL, I think the number was more like 96%. So it depends on, one, how we measure access, and two, how we gather the data, right? But it would be good if we could avoid using our energy to compare data and argue which data is more reliable, and we use our energy to do something about the data, right? So again, it's critical that this information system we are talking about is looked at so that those type of discrepancies can be addressed. But nonetheless, whatever it is, the objective is to have universal access. And again, we'll have to look into the definition. When you look at implementation, how do we define universal access? You cannot make a customer or a potential customer connect to the grid if they choose not to. And we know we have communities in Belize that, for their own cultural reasons, but that does not mean that we don't provide access to it. In other words, it's there, it's available for them to use if and when they want to use it. So how we define access becomes important as well. But the bottom line is, we simply want to give every Belizean an opportunity to have access to reliable, in this case, we are measuring it just based on electricity, right? As we look at implementation of the policy, we have to also look at other energy sources, like I mentioned, firewood versus some other form of energy source for cooking, right? So, and then what we have done in this process would make sure that the policy objectives of the energy policy is aligned to the updated, nationally determined contribution. That's what our government signed off on. It could be better, right? But at a minimum, we have to ensure that the energy sector does its part. Because when you look at the NDC, it is broken down by sector. You have how much you expect from forestry and land use. Well, in that case, it's more carbon sink. It's really absorbing carbon, right? You look at what you're getting from the various sectors, and energy has a part to play in making sure we meet those national commitments. So these become the key performance indicators from this policy, and the intention is that the ministry then devise a plan to ensure that you're informed of, one, your contribution to the emissions, right? But two, that you collectively work together to try to manage and minimize greenhouse gases emission. But there are some other benefits we expect from this policy, right? Outside of the, the economic benefit, the environmental benefit, and so on. Reduce costs. To reduce costs, we have to collaborate with the Ministry of Transport to improve public transport services. A high percentage of our citizens choose to have a private car, a private transport, simply because they're not happy, for whatever reason, with public transportation, right? And nobody has to tell you that's very expensive. Private transportation versus public transportation, right? Is also less efficient. When public transportation is working properly, private transportation is far less efficient, right? So in working towards achieving the energy policy objectives, one of the benefits will be, as we work with the transport department, how to improve public transport services to make it more attractive. There is a very, very good report. It's known as Comprehensive National Transport, what's the last 2 words? Transportation Master Plan. It's a very, very detailed study. Good surveys. There are a lot of surveys of people taking public transport versus people. There's a lot of information in that master plan. Unfortunately, the master plan looked at infrastructure and services of the transport sector, never looked at the energy consumption of the sector. And so when the Ministry of Energy then collaborates with the transport ministry, it would be how together you're talking about change behavior. This is one of the change behaviors we need to have, where people find it more convenient to be able to take public transport instead of having to rely on, many times, some used vehicle from the United States mainly, not necessarily efficient. It's typically the older vehicles, right? Where people have to rely on, many times, you see them taking the public transport because their vehicle has broken down, right? Parts is an issue. So, and it's a quality of life issue. If you can conveniently know, if you know the bus is going to leave this point A and reliably gets to point B, you might find it simpler to just get to point A and take the public transport if it's comfortable, if it's reliable, and if it's cost effective, amongst many other things. But that report, the Comprehensive National Transport Master Plan, I would encourage you all, anybody that has anything to do with either e-mobility or the petroleum industry should want to look at that plan to see how we can make this transition and how they could play a part in making the transition. I already mentioned cost of living and foreign currency demand. I've mentioned that over and over and over. Objective 5, the big one again, increase investment opportunities. As we seek to maximize and take advantage of the indigenous energy sources, this is a huge potential, right? The vehicles can talk about, the Fortis investment in vehicle can speak about it. The ASR can speak about, from their experience already, what it means for them to have gone ahead of the rest of us and invest in indigenous energy sources. And there are plenty more out there for us to maximize, all right? Obviously, most of the energy sources that we're looking at are agricultural based. Fine, you have the solar, which is not, but the biomass and other energy sources are agricultural based. Not the most, but a significant portion is agricultural based. right? And so it's an opportunity to increase agricultural production, because then the costs of production get shared between the commodity they are producing and the energy that is generated from it, as in the case of ASR. Increase employment. Obviously, increasing industry increases employment. And of course, foreign currency again. Access. Mr. Moreno and the BEL guys could tell you, a flood condition, a hurricane, you have nightmares if you're at BEL when people find unsafe ways of accessing electricity. There have been a few electrocutions, right? And so on, when people seek to find an unsafe way of accessing electricity, right? Many times when the linemen go to work in those flood conditions, they have to be extremely careful, because you have people creating their own distribution network, quite unsafe, right? Lines running, some lines literally running on the ground. It's okay during the dry, but in flood conditions, right? These linemen are, and anybody, the community is at risk. And so this issue of universal access is not just one of quality of life, it's about saving lives. And so it's something that we should take very seriously. And I mentioned already Objective 7 and the impact on for collaboration, but there's the blue bond. I've not researched the blue bond sufficiently, but the government still sees the blue bond as a serious economic opportunity for the country. And the question becomes, should it only be at the governmental level? The benefits comes in. And so you're looking at the possibility of incentives being created for those who contribute positively to that, even at just a sectoral level, right? So these are some of the other benefits beyond the KPIs that was highlighted in the slide before. Now, let's look at the targets. And the message I'm trying to deliver here is, I keep beating up on fossil fuels, right? Who's the Sol, right? Yes, we have to be very clear that the intention is to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, right? But in a way where, if you could achieve where that objective can be achieved, and the investors in that sector still have a way to survive, that's what we should be working towards, right? The option of biofuels creates that opportunity because it will still require a distribution network for the biofuels, right? And so that issue of, yes, the intention is to go from here down to here in terms of consumption. On the converse, to expand bagasse production, butane production, from the fact that it is still the more reliable cooking fuel available, right? The production is for butane production, consumption to still increase, Gilly, right? Imported electricity. A lot of time people talk about energy security, and they say it in the context of electricity security. They talk about, oh, we don't want to buy from Mexico. That's short-sighted. Trading with Mexico is the way to go. There are times if you produce energy at a competitive price, there are times when we could be sending electrons in that direction, and there are times when, but besides that, no man is an island. And for any power system to believe that it is better for them to function isolated is short-sighted. What I always find interesting about this debate is we speak about not using Mexico, which sounds like disconnecting from Mexico, or probably just not using Mexico energy. The same way DG customers speak about not using BL's energy. You realize that? What the people who are looking for solar PV talk about, we want to produce our own energy so we don't have to buy from BEL. And then BEL says, we want to produce all our energy so we don't have to buy from Mexico. Stay connected. Look at the opportunity. Somebody mentioned the issue of the opportunity to trade or to sell excess. You can't sell excess if you're not connected, right? So look at the trading opportunities, right? But like any good, reliable energy system, you want to have sufficient capacity in country, right? But you want to trade economically. So as you look at how the policy looks at, yes, maximize local production, maximize it to the point that you could trade it. You still need that same connection, right, to do it. Similarly, when you talk about DG, what is it that DG customers want? When they have excess electricity, what do they want to do with it? Sell it into the grid. Can they do it if they are disconnected? That's a rhetorical question. All right? So we have to look at it in its broader sense and the opportunity to trade in energy. We looked at some other sources, and some of these sources are pushed back into 20 because there's still some development work to continue on wild cane. There's still development work to continue on waste to energy, but the research has already started. I don't think nobody in here from 5Cs, right? But 5Cs has been doing work on wild cane, right? And I know that SWAMA, what's SWAMA again? Solid Waste Management. There have been some research already done on waste to energy potential. Not in a huge way, but the whole time saying is one, whatever, full basket. All right? And so we should always look at all the options. Now, implementation. And probably I left the most colorful slide because I'm talking about the hard work, implementation, right? And this is the energy planning process we followed in putting together this energy plan. So we started with energy information, established some baseline. We did the forecasting, did our vision, did all of that. Now we are here, implementation, which requires all of these resources and more. Like we mentioned earlier, we need to have the legislative framework to support this policy. At the very beginning, we talked about human resource, institutional strengthening to get the work done. We talk about other policies, tax policies, investment policies. Because one of the things is mentioned in the document is there will be a very serious discussion as to the level of support the Ministry of Finance can give to all of this with its decision on taxation on fuels. What's the current tax level on fuels? Right? And so, as we look at the economic benefit of local production, we have to look at the trade-off of that versus taxation and imported fuel. And that is for the economists to get in the room and work out what is most optimum and beneficial for us as a nation. This cannot be done in isolation. We have to be in the room together to make those decisions. Investment policies, there's some very good work already been done. Ms. Nadia went out the room. Leroy is here, on investment policies. So that is already advanced, and it's lined up towards the PPP approach. And so there already work being done on investment policies to support and enable the implementation of the energy policy. research and development. I always explain this to people by saying, when you want to build a house, you get somebody to design the house, hopefully, but you also do some level of research to determine what it's going to cost you to build it. Then you go out to bid. But you go out to build with knowledge of what it's going to cost you to make that investment. When we go out to bid for energy projects, it will be good for the ministry to make sure it has done its research, to get a good understanding of what is the cost of the project, but also what is the economic benefit of the project. Otherwise, you can end up in a situation where investors look at it as import substitution. So you buy it for 10 cents, like I said earlier. So they said, we could sell you it at 8 cents, but it's really a 6 cents project. Not knowing it's a 6 cents project, you'll be happy with 8 cents. And what is it going to cost you to do the research to realize that you should have been paying 6 cents? In the scheme of things, a minuscule cost compared to the cost of the project. So do the research. Very critical. Investment funding. Once you do the research and you know, especially you're using natural resources, then you could sit at the table with the investors and says, this is the value of this project. I want to partner with you, but I know my value. But I know my value. I know the value of our natural resources. Let's partner in a position where we do it from a position of knowledge. We both know what we are doing here, and we know how to maximize and benefit from it. Information technology. This is having to do with the resource you need to build that management information system. The resource you will need to monitor things like greenhouse gases and all of that. The information technology you will need to make this happen better. And of course, the big money, the energy infrastructure. These are the resources, the key resources we need to implement this plan or this policy. This is a concept, a work in progress, so please don't shoot me. Right? Because it tries to establish the relationship between the key stakeholders in the sector. Right? Anybody that tracks the sector, track the court system, could tell you too often there are matters reaching the court about who controls what, who has the say over what in the energy sector. Making this clear as to how we are trying to achieve this, everybody understanding their role. It's like football. The goalkeeper shouldn't be out there trying to score goals. Right? If you're the goalkeeper in this, your job is to protect your goal. So once you know your role in this, then the relationship between the other entities becomes important, because how you pass the ball around determines if you're going to score or not. So the relationship here recognizes the Ministry of Finance as the owner of the assets. Like I mentioned, we have $400 million. The government of Belize, on behalf of us, have $400 million invested in energy. And some direction need to come from that, with collaboration between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Energy. The PUC remains in its role, having a relationship with the Ministry of Energy, autonomous body, but the appointments do come from the Ministry of Energy, right? And the PUC regulates the electricity providers. I think conveniently we put the podium here so the BL people and the PUC people can see this part of the presentation. And we are looking at a similar structure for fuel service providers. Currently, the petroleum industry, the only two set of regulations exist for the petroleum industry. Standards, in terms of petroleum standards by Bureau of Standards, and taxation and regulated fuel prices by the Ministry of Finance. That's it. The Ministry of Energy, basically, to this point, has not been integrally involved in oversight of that part of the energy sector. All right? And then the two green are entities that are not yet established, but the proposal is to establish them. We talk about the asset management company on behalf of the government, and we also talk about the procurement agency. This procurement agency is the one that invites tenders and bids for the energy projects. Once it completes the tender process, then the management of those projects goes over to PUC. That is the proposal, or one of the concepts being discussed. And I'm pretty certain we want as much feedback from you, the stakeholders, because this chat is critical to you all. Right? But it's just trying to move from a situation where there's a kind of loose relationship between some of these players or actors in the sector, and there needs to be more collaboration, more coordination between all of the players so that we are all playing on one team. So that's what this is about. We also recognize that this process requires the input and guidance and facilitation of the Ministry of Economic Development when it comes to working with the investors. So that this does not ignore the role of the Ministry of Economic Development and Beltrade in that process when you're working with the investors. And I expect to get a lot of questions on that chart. Now, this is just a very first attempt at looking at the implementation from the resource requirement for each of the objectives and some rough timelines for when some of these things have to be mature or reach a point of development that it moves the whole energy policy towards successful implementation. And so if you go back to this slide, you have the icons that explains what each of these resources are. And then you come here and it shows how these resources, like I said, the one we keep talking about is the legislation required to improve governance of the sector. Obviously, the human resources required and the collaboration required. All right? And then similarly, that's basically how we look at a very high level. Like we've always said, my role as a consultant is to create a framework for that type of discussion and the plan. Whoever is responsible for executing the plan should be the one to finalize the plan. Right? But this at least sets a framework for the persons responsible for the execution of the plan. Right? And you will realize that you must have to start looking at which of these boxes you fit in. Because for the most part, you'll be fitting into one of these boxes. It's to play some role in the execution of the energy policy. So taking the policy to implementation requires now a comprehensive action plan that should encourage input from you all. One of the benefits I could easily tell you, lesson learned, 2023 versus 2012, is the level of stakeholder sessions we've been having in putting this together should, one, help to give a clearer picture as to where we're going, where the country should be going, but it should also minimize, let me put it in a positive light. It should ensure more buy-in, because you've had opportunities, this is the third one, to be able to provide input into that final document, right? And the more you're able to assure yourself that the things in the document covers the things that you would have wanted to see in it, then it makes it more likely that you'll buy into the execution of it. And so that's one of the critical aspects of this and the prior stakeholder sessions, to make sure that you see yourself as an active part, an active player in the implementation of this policy. And with that, I get to the other ones where it's the same thing, where you look at, here we speak about one of the icons here, and I don't know if there are much media persons around, but also speaks to public education with support from the media for some of the things that we want to do in this policy. So you try to look at as much resources as possible will be required, because execution of this plan is not limited to the persons in this room. Successful execution of the plan is for the public to know where we are going and buying into it. We are hoping that you become ambassadors of the policy, and besides just executors of it. But it's important that we do have that public education in key aspects of the policy to make sure that we are all heading in the same direction. And with that, we're open to questions and answers.
Any questions? Any comments?
Good morning, Joshua Pot from the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you for the presentations, Mr. Locke. I just had a very quick question, and it has to do with under the recommended actions, number 4 talks about the establishment of a national energy company owned by the government to manage their current new investments in the energy sector. And I didn't get a lot about that from the presentations. I was just wondering if you could explain that a little bit more.
It's very simple. The government is looking to public-private partnership. Even from an institutional standpoint, how will that partnership be structured? Representing the government's interest in the partnership. If you're having a company that you have partnership, right, you will need to have an entity established for that. But it's more important than that. What is the objective of the government's investment in the energy sector? Who defines that? Who ensures that that operation that is invested in is delivering on its objective? Not only decides that, what role should it play in ensuring that it's done? If it has $400 million invested in it, it has a stake in it. It needs to have a say in that investment.
Just to add to that, and maybe for clarification, when we talk about this new type of agency, we're not talking about that this agency would run day-to-day activities of whatever partnership the government has. It's more at looking out for the best interests of the government, such as they can, to begin off with, serve as in a monitoring and evaluation role to ensure that the government's targets and policies are met with the partnership that they have, and also looks forward thinking, being that a lot of times these PPPs are BOTs, build, operate, and transfer at the end of a certain contract life. Many a times we reach the end of this contract life, but the government may not know what to do with this entity, or has not prepared to take the next step, whether that be either actually accepting the transfer or renewing or extending another contract with the same entity. So what this agency is looking at is that advisory role as well, to advise government what are the best steps to take in order to ensure their investment is well taken care of.
And I think I need to explain what I mean by a company. Are you saying, we're not saying that the government is going to operate a plant. The government is a shareholder in that investment. It has directors, it should have directors on the board for that investment. But do you want directors that are just picked per investment, or you want directors that are together as a form of a company with one clear strategy and objective for the government's investment? Right? So you're looking at that company at the highest level, at the ownership and board level, right? I think you might be seeing it as you think government is going to be hiring operators and, no, that's the management of the company. But the ownership has to have a representation, and ownership has to have a very clear strategy and vision as to why it's why is it investing in energy, and how it's going to ensure that its purpose for investment is met.
Following up, William Osher again, following up on that conversation I just got in, but I heard this discussion following bill operation transfer, and I want to know, for example, there is bill operation own. There are two different types. What would be the priority of projects, for example, from the government side where it's bill operation and own compared to bill operation transfer? Because not all investors would want to transfer thereafter. How do we take that into consideration within the policy? I'm going
to answer it from a theoretical standpoint, since I'm only a consultant on this, right? And I don't in any way want to pretend that I am representing the government's position. But I do know that boot projects, right, versus BOO projects is a decision you make at the time of the investment. It's difficult for you to sit here and say, this is going to be a boot project. It's based on the time of the investment, looking at the nature of the investment, you determine, okay, that's a natural resource. Because most of these projects are going to be capital. Some of them are going to be capitalizing on natural resources, but most of them are going to be capitalizing on natural resources, but different nature natural resources. And so it's a one-off, it's a one-by-one decision you make. It's not, oh, our projects are going to be boot. No, that's not how you do that. And there are sufficient models internationally where you can look at to see this type of project with this type of structure, corporate structure, is best to handle in that way or not. So it really varies, but the government has to be in a position to make a decision if they end up with a boot project. To at least, even if they have to make, if they choose to make the decision to extend or roll over, but it's their asset. The reason, the key word behind the T is the transfer of the asset and the ownership of the asset, and they should have a say in how that asset is utilized henceforth. Well, it should have DC, really, not a say, because it's their asset, in the case where it's a boot. And you wouldn't want a government to start inheriting these projects and not prepared to do so. You have to build the capability to manage that asset. And that's what a company looks like.
Yeah, just to reinforce what has been mentioned, it is something that needs to be looked at a project-by-project basis. I'm sure that the government is open to consider any proposal, and based on those proposals, then the detailed discussion is then had in terms of how do we look at the sustainability and sustainability of that project.
And remember, the government already indicated that its preferred investment structure is the PPP. So you're not looking at, in many instances, you're not looking at a case where the government is saying they're going to be the sole. They're looking at partnerships. So you're looking at they're having equity in these assets. They could even sell a portion of the asset back to a partner that they think is strategic enough for them to partner with to manage or operate the asset for them. But those are business decisions. And you need to have business people in the room to make those business decisions.
Mirko Schröder, European Union again. 3 points. First one is you mentioned that the targets are matching with the NDC targets. I'm not sure about the NDC target time horizon. Is 2030 or 2035? 30. And then you mentioned the economic benefits related to blue bonds. I think you could extend it. Let's say green bonds will be probably a future topic as well, or you leave it more open, let's say. And my last point is I see two challenges with this policy approval by the cabinet. It's when it comes to the figures, the targets itself. Probably it will be asked how calculated. How did you calculate these figures? On which base? Because you are giving numbers, it would be becoming the targets, and the government, I guess, will be committed to achieve these targets. So probably it's one of the challenges. And the second challenge I see is the institutional setup. When you propose, I don't know if you propose this model you presented, then it comes to the creation of two new agencies, and this could create some resistance as well.
I would be shocked if any change doesn't bring some resistance. Right? I think George Bryce used to say, progress brings problems. Right? So you expect that. I've always heard people say, why are so many vehicles on the road? I say, let's start with you parking yours. And I say, no, that's not the change I wanted. So change will bring resistance. It should be soberly thought out. It should be thought out and discussed in environments like these, in forums like these. And then some decisions can only come out of that type of. So if you're doing a policy like this that's talking about changing behavior, and you don't get any resistance, then you're not changing behavior. Because changing behavior makes somebody uncomfortable.
Yeah, behavior, yes, but on the other hand, it's related to additional money, no?
Yes,
resources. So
it's an investment.
Yeah.
It's an investment. If you are trying to manage this sector, let's look at the BTB model. Right? You have enough models in this country of agencies that are funded from the PUC model, that are funded from the sector in able to better manage the sector. So those things have been considered, at least in the proposal submitted to the government. Clearly the government will make their decision as to how best to do it, but in making the recommendation to government, funding of those institutions was also contemplated. To answer the ones about the targets, I wouldn't want to bore you with the size spreadsheet we have with all the calculations. So all of these spreadsheets all of these targets were derived bottom up from really the end user usage, understanding their usage, projecting their usage, looking at all those things. Fine, they are assumptions, none of them are, but yes, it is not targets that were extracted out just, I remember having this discussion with some of my peers about a policy, and they said, but a policy should be aspirational, but it should also be grounded in reality. And so we both agreed that, yeah, it should be aspirational, but it should be grounded in reality. And so it has to be linked to some real assessment of, yes, it's still possible, like for instance, the projects. You may have a project that might look viable on paper, but no investor is interested. For whatever reason, there might be better projects somewhere else that they prefer to put their money. But to answer your question simply, there's a lot of numbers behind the simple numbers that you saw today. Right? It's minimum of about 3 weeks of consultant work to produce the numbers.
Thank you. Sorry, I might just follow up on this point that is raised by Mirko, and to perhaps emphasize the point that you raised, Jeffrey, earlier, that in order to reach a data-based approach to this policy, the investment has been made to look at the data. Very fortunately, the energy unit has got very good quality data by comparison in the region, in the Caribbean. And so there are now nearly 5 annual energy reports available, 3 published, and that data has been the basis on which Jeffrey has been able to proceed, in addition to other data that he's been able to collect from customs and from other sources. And what we have seen in this process is that that data is extremely valuable, in our opinion, from the support, the technical assistance side. And so we've suggested to take a lot of that baseline data out of the policy, where it was originally in the first 3 chapters, and to publish that separately as a baseline study that reflects on these past 10 years, and that stands as a reference document. Of course, that also should be peer-reviewed and be agreed before it gets published. But we are in that process now, and we are taking this information that Jeffrey has produced, which you have not seen, and which will be published as a baseline study by the ministry for the benefit of the sector. And I think we hope that this provides a depth and quality to this dialogue which we're having, which to my mind seems to be extremely valuable. There have been extremely good points raised this morning. And so I just wanted to give that background to say this baseline information is not a mystery, it's not hidden, it will become available, and we do want your input to give somehow a veracity to that document, but that it can stand as a reference document.
I have one quick comment or question, I don't know. I know you were talking about peopling the policy. So my question has to do, maybe this is the more the communication side of me, in terms of what, is there a communication strategy? And is it something that there's money to put behind? Because most of the times when you do have any kind of energy discussion in media, it's because there's some dispute between some agency and PUC. Sorry to say it that bluntly, but that's the fact. So I think people still are very much hands-off. They're afraid of the electric shock from energy conversations, and I think there's not been a focused effort to really people the policies that have been developed.
Glenn, you want to share some of the discussions we've had around, the whole thing about communicating?
I really want to recognize that comment and really amplify again the fact that this discussion, in my view, from my experience, the energy sector is what I would call a Cinderella sector. It's somehow hidden until there's a problem. And then everyone wants to talk about it, uninformed. They want to say something about the energy sector. And nobody's benefiting from this. So in a way, we are in this process, which I see as a sort of the light being shone on the energy sector. It drives the economy and our lives, but at the same time, it's part of the economy. And so it's a really valuable part of our lives that we need to address. But we don't generally, as lay people, have the language. So the terminology is opaque, difficult to understand, intimidating. The access to the players is often difficult because they're sitting in important looking buildings and so on. And so, in a way, we want to try and bring this to citizens and to have that dialogue and to have these conversations, informed conversations. But this, of course, takes time. So I hope that this process that we have been supporting, with the support of the EU, with the partnership of the ministry, consultants, BEL, other stakeholders, PUC, that this is becoming more of a real conversation, meaningful conversation. But I think we would welcome any opportunity to enhance that Just incidentally, we still have 1 year of EU support around this topic. So let's think. I mean, come to us with suggestions, because I think it's a valuable point.
I have one quick add-on. I don't know if it's a comment, but because I like the fact that you were talking about how opaque the conversation and the vocabulary and everything seems to be, but we still have areas where have somehow gotten public attention, but still seems like a pipe dream. Simple things like electric cars. Most people are fascinated by them, but they still see it as something that I will never own in my lifetime because of how expensive it is, right? So I think there are some conversations, there are some hooks to get the public, but until you have some policy, some incentives, etc., for people to actually make the gateway into realizing how beneficial this dance with energy can really be. People continue to feel as if, though I know in conversations with people that you don't dictate anything or you don't get to decide anything when it comes to energy. The bill, you have to pay it, or they cut out your electricity bill. It's that simple. So you're always on the receiving end, that there's not necessarily an appetite for people to really engage and see how energy is a part of everything that we do. I like what Mr. Locke said earlier, at the very top of his presentation about how energy is really built into everything that we do. But it's almost invisible because people, they just resign themselves to thinking I have to pay it, or I don't have this, or I don't have that, and I don't get to be a part of the decision-making process. So I think that's what I have to say.
Just to share, and totally get the point in terms of communication strategy. I strongly believe that any policy should be complemented by an action plan, which should then detail the communication strategy that would be used. If I reference what has been done with the e-governance aspect of the ministry, it was precisely that. It generated a policy, action plan, and a strong communication strategy to complement and ensure that there is public awareness in what is being done. I would bring in again the e-mobility project that's currently being executed. It's a pilot project precisely to start to sensitize the general public as it relates to electric vehicles. I can attest that the Belize City Council has also engaged in what they call epic stakeholder sessions to precisely do what you're saying. Now, of course, the communication strategy needs to be aligned. It also needs to be enhanced and needs to be more public in terms of engaging the media houses, engaging the general community as it relates to the pros and the cons as it relates to electric mobility or electric vehicles. Because yes, it seems far-reached or far-fetched, but it's something that needs to be discussed in more detail. And the way we're seeing it is that it's the future, it's what's coming next. So we either move along and ensure that we have the right policies, the right regulation, the right infrastructure in place to support that technology. But I totally get the point in terms of communication. We need to enhance and we need to be more public to discuss these topics with the general public.
Yes, I have one. Caymans is from Fortis Belize. Just to follow up a little bit more on what Lynn and William have been saying, I think when we're looking at communications, we also need to look at the industry as an opportunity, and particularly from an educational standpoint. Now, Mr. Locke mentioned education in his presentation, but I don't think we emphasize the opportunities enough. I mean, you go out there and you hear what the key careers are, students are thinking they should be going into, and you don't hear careers around energy the way you should. We're talking about EVs coming up. We're talking about much more investment. If this policy is well implemented, there should be much more investment in the energy industry at all sectors. And these are people-intensive industries. So what that should mean is that it creates an incredible layer of opportunity for our young people if our educational sector is part of it. But it also means that when we're communicating it, we need to communicate that opportunity so that the public sees beyond just the light bill, just whether or not they go from ICE vehicles to EV vehicles, and start to see what's in it for them. And I think it's important we don't forget that part.
Just an editorial thing. In reviewing the document, the one I have, maybe I got the wrong document, I saw up to 2030. But then when Mr. Lack was producing the slides, 2040. So will we get that revision before we make a comment in the coming days? Thank you.
Yes, you will. All right. What we did is, when we did it, is to say, okay, let's do the 2030 projection first, get comments to see if there's going to be any significant change in the draft before we spend a whole heap of resources projecting to 2040. So after we got the no objection from the government saying, okay, this is something with enough framework for us to, that's when the 2040 projections were computed. So those were just computed.
And just to add to that, one of the other reasons that we did it that way is because this policy, as most policies are, is for a 15 to 20 year period, so that takes us up to 2040. But the reality is that we currently have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are slated for 2030, which most of our NDCs are tied to. So we need to ensure that we reach those targets by 2030 as well. So in actuality, both figures will be incorporated into the final report and final policy.
Just a quick note to acknowledge the comment from Ms. Menzies as it relates to the educational aspect and capacity building. We have been having discussions with the Ministry of Education, particularly as it relates to the STEAM program that they are currently beginning in the Belize City area, in terms of how do we stimulate these technical fields, both from an engineering level and a technician level, to be able to have the proper in-house capacity to deal with these technologies. So, point well taken, and that's a discussion that needs to be hashed out in more detail, and of course, in collaboration with the stakeholders also, to see where some improvements can occur.
Yes, thank you very much. Leroy Mendares, Jeff from Beltrade. Really, I've been listening, and I must commend the work, CEO Urbina and Director, really, the work that has been done. Some of us have been in the energy, in the energy arena for quite a while. I can look at my right here, and Dr., the good doctor here as well. But one of the things we must remember is that policies do not exist in isolation. That we must remember, because we tend to be speaking as if this is some little fish flying in a big ocean. And that's not the case. There are a number of other policies that were developed. Now, we do understand, and Jeff keeps saying it, we want to reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. That's true, especially for the fact that it's indexed to oil, and so there's volatility in pricing. And remember, really the whole cost of power pass-through and that type of thing. But in terms of policies, we're talking about investment in this case. We talk about PPP, we talk about ownership. Let me just say this, that the landscape in terms of economic incentives, that has changed. As a matter of fact, there's a new fiscal incentive act, and I say new because it was replaced. There was broad-based consultation. There's a new fiscal incentive act which has simplified the process as we try to meet those changes suggested by foreign direct investors in order to become, and I will say this now because endless opportunities. I'm wearing this shirt because of the Belize Investment Summit coming up next week. But that Fiscal Incentive Act when you really look at it and what exists and the integration, especially when it comes to our priority areas, we have looked at a number of indicators. There were 11 identified by the World Bank. We addressed those. And we didn't sit at a table and address them. There was this broad-based consultation, and it simply means even from the point, energy is one of those things. And I'm glad that Jeff continues to make the distinction. Electricity is included. They are not equal to each other, but is a part of. But when we talk about energy, too often indeed, people believe that it means just electricity. Conservation has to be thrown into the mix as well. You know, we have to remember that. It's a part of the mix. So those economic incentives exist. The Fiscal Incentive Act of 2023 includes those things. There's also policies that were developed where, again, there's a marrying or the courting, if you will, but they have to marry each other because they're government policies. The National Investment Policy and Strategy, for example, which has morphed because it now integrates other policies and strategies. It has 9 pillars, and within those pillars, because I think that's where Ms. Kia was going, when we talk about capacity building, there has to be a redirection when it comes to a greener Belize. There has to be a redirection in terms of capacity building rather than importing capacity. These are some of the things that we have to look at. The summit, again, I throw it there, will focus on green, blue, and orange economy because it's an all-inclusive macro approach to economic development. So that's one thing. Remember, there was recently the launch of the medium-term strategy as well. All of these things, again, not piggybacking, but looking at overall national objectives and policies and how these things are integrated. And so under that national investment policy, we develop an export strategy because Jeff did mention, and he and I spoke about this recently, that integrated in that PPA, that agreement between CFE and Belize, is the fact that there's a clause in there that says excess can be re-exported. And in this case, we're talking about renewables. So there are a lot of things that are being done. Now let me just sell the Belize Investment Summit a bit, if I will. I was just putting together some notes about a greener and sustainable future. Let me put a part as the first word in there, because it includes all of these things. And I've seen your passion, and indeed we cannot escape it, if we do not take into consideration the whole digitization and automation that we have been speaking about. So, for me, like I said, it's more of comment, it's more of some remarks, or just to really add to what has been done. And I'm glad that the whole economics of it is integrated, and I heard Jeff saying that as well. One of the things we must do with dependence or reliance on energy, it simply means we have to find a way to reduce the cost of consumption. That's without a doubt. And the only way we can do that is if we find additional means, and of course with conformity to climate change. Because we have signed on to reducing and becoming really net zero by 2050 as well. So there's the 2030 goals, but there are 2050 goals. And I can tell you, and Hossein knows this, and Director knows this, and Jeff as a consultant, and Ishmael is over there as well from the EDC. These are things we have been committed to. These are things that we're working on. So please attend the summit. And you'll find out much more, because you'll hear a lot more about the same subject we're talking about here. In fact, Jose and I sit on around one of the panels here as well. And so it simply means there's much more that you will hear. The whole thing about least cost, dispatch, and where we get our energy from, generation, and those kind of things, it's a passion of ours because, my good friend, we sitting there, and well, I don't want to call his name, Jeff, I don't want to call the man's name, but, really, it's something that we have to continue to focus on because there is no way we can divorce ourselves from the fact that we become even more energy, more inclusive, dependent. Thank you.
If there is no other comment or question, I have actually one for the entire group. And it's a topic that Jeff touched on, but we didn't focus on. So I wanted to get the feedback of the group. And that's the inclusion of gender within the energy policy. How do we improve that? So I'd like to hear the feedback now from stakeholders within this room.
If I may go first, because that should not even be a question anymore. And the reason I'm saying it, Ryan, is because as we know, I mean, you know, really, SDG number 5, gender equity. 1 to 4, that whole thing about reduce poverty, all of those different things, SDG 13 and 14 as well. But especially SDG 5. The fact that you have seen this paradigm shift, even if it's not fully embraced, there's so many more women now in energy. There's so many women now included in that discussion. As a matter of fact, again, let me go back to the summit, and yes, I am promoting it. You will find out that there's a lot of shamelessly, both William, the one in front of me too, is a board member, shamelessly, Ishmael, shamelessly, without apology. But I must say, you know, in 2021, for example, the first version of it, a primary focus was economic empowerment of women. And it did not segregate, it did not discriminate, because it was very inclusive. Now, when you talk about the inclusion of women in the green space, I think a lot of it is happening. Take a look at what is happening in the South, for example, with those 3 magnificent women who are lighting up Toledo. We need to promote them even more, and we did that. And what they're doing, remember now, you learn by example, and I think there are far more individuals now who understand that mathematics is an art. What a way to put it, because art makes mathematics so easier to learn. So personally for me, I don't think it should have been a question. I think it should have been a first thought and very much included.
Responding to that, I think we need to look not only at the electrical part of the energy issue, because within the fuel aspect, where there is need for use of biomass, the whole agricultural component, many females are integrated within that area. And so also looking at energy in its holistic aspect outside of just electricity itself, I believe you would be able to capture as well a lot of women within the energy sector in itself.
Hi, afternoon. I'm Rumil Arana. I'm an economist from the Compact Development Team. I'm associated with MCC. As it pertains to the topic you've mentioned, across the policy, there is a need for technical assistance. And I think that is one of the prime opportunities where you could infuse gender equality into the mix, because if I'm not mistaken, the landscape is still dominated by males. Now, as it pertains to trainings for different individuals, it could be more focused towards women. Ms. Menzies spoke about the job opportunities and all of that. If we're talking about training and education from even the younger individual, the younger population, when we're talking from that aspect, there could be more focus towards getting women involved in these types of opportunities, whether it be to be technicians as it pertains to DG, to be championing energy efficiency, however they are needed within that sector. The technical assistance space or the education space provides an opportunity for us to target more women in these areas.
We have a comment from Verdal. It says the ministry MPU needs to recruit more women in the next energy department, or at least to ensure gender parity in the incoming energy entities to be created. And it starts with capacity building today, with existing women who are already in the energy in Belize. So I have to say that the ministry is very supportive of women, and we have one, Kayla. She's not here today, Kayla Gabriel. The ministry had made the effort to recognize 5 women earlier this year in April, and the reason for that is communication. We want to inspire and influence other young women, and the focus was on what inspired these women to get into a field that is male-dominated, and they spoke about the importance of them being sensitized at the education level in their high schools, in their universities. And we have University of Belize here, who is also embarking on that mission to become more a leadership role in influencing those programs. The vocational sector was invited, they couldn't make it. But I just wanted to mention that because the energy unit is very strong on that. And we have 2 other women here in our presence that were recognized, Mrs. Menzies and Mrs. Coolin Simpson, as 2 of those recognized persons that are leading in women being in technical roles. Just my 2 cents. Yes. Okay, if there's no other questions or comments, we are going to close. And before Director Cobb give the closing remarks, I want to make a short announcement. Firstly, I will send the presentation to all of you that attended and signed, because I'm aware that some of you here did not register. So we will check the register to ensure that everyone here gets a copy of the presentation. And we will also, I think Director will be touching on your feedback following today, that we would still open the opportunity for you to send comments before next week or by Friday. Also, the lunch is being served downstairs. So on your way out, those 2 beautiful ladies at the entrance will give you a ticket, and downstairs we will carry on with lunch and networking. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to start off by saying thank you to everybody who attended today. We know all of your schedules are very busy, and it shows your dedication to this sector and to this process and the policy by dedicating the time that you did today. As Mr. Dasi had stated, we will be sending out this presentation along with the people who did not register but signed in today, a copy of the policy itself, so that you'll be able to provide comments. We are asking to please provide comments, if can, by this Friday. Reason for that type deadline is that we have commitment from Cabinet to review this policy as soon as possible. So that is the reason for our tight deadline. But even if you have any questions, you can get my personal contact from the front desk, that you'll be able to contact me via email, WhatsApp, or any calls. If you need any further explanation on any questions or comments that you may have before writing in your formal comments by this Friday. And this is not the end of the policy as well. While this will be the final draft that will be accepted by government, there are the roadmaps. There are other strategies that we'll be developing. So any other comments that we receive after that hard deadline will be incorporated to those other documents as well. A policy shouldn't be end-all work. The policy is a living document. A living document that reflects current requirements and the future plans of both the government and the necessities of the citizens of the country. So with that, I just want to reiterate and say thank you all for coming once again. Have a good day.